We have another wonderful presentation by a gentleman by the name of Kenneth K. Koskodan. He's a journalist and a book author from Grand Blanc, Michigan. And he wrote a book some years ago called No Greater Ally, The Untold Story of Poland's Forces in World War II. Mr. Koskodan. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, thank you to the conference organizers for inviting me here today. We're privileged to hear from a lot of prominent, accomplished speakers, and then there's me. I'm just a guy who wrote a book. I'm little more than a passionate student of history and of the truth. Come from a Polish background. Thought I was very well read and knew a lot about the history of World War II. But this is what I was taught growing up. If we learned anything here in the United States as kids in history class, we heard this quite a bit. This is a quote from a very prominent historian. And I don't know how else to put it other than to say this is, at best, lazy. At worst, I'll leave that to everybody else's interpretation. So I'm going to back up a little bit here. I've probably what is probably a very optimistic presentation here. So some of it I'm going to go through very, very quickly in an effort to simply make a few points. That the motivation, the impetus of this conference is exactly what motivated me to write my book. I'm asked that all the time. I grew up from a family of Polish immigrants. As I mentioned earlier, I thought I was a pretty well-read student of history. But that quote from earlier today and things like the Polish Air Force was destroyed on the ground and Polish cavalry attacking German tanks, it just never sat well with me. It bothered me for years and years and years, but I didn't know any better. So at some point I decided I wanted to find out more and find out if that was actually the truth. Lo and behold, it couldn't be further from the truth. I'm sure everybody, if not everybody, most of the people in this room already know this, but on my quest, I guess you'd call it, to discover the truth, I was privileged and humbled to meet people, veterans who were there in every theater of war that the Poles fought. I was able to be introduced to people, get to know them a little bit, had the honor of knowing them for however briefly, and they were willing to share their stories with me. Somewhere along the way, in the back of my head, I just kept hearing a voice saying, somebody's got to tell this story. We need to know this here. People need to know this, and we don't. Somebody should tell the story. Somebody should tell the story. Well, nobody did, and so I decided I would give it a try. So again, I say I'm just a guy. I'm just a guy who was trusted to tell other people's stories. And at the end of it all, I hope I've honored them. And this is some of what I've learned along the way. We hear a lot about Poland. I'm not going to go through all these facts and figures. We hear, if anybody wants the presentation, I'd be happy to share it with them. But another thing we learned, or I learned as a kid here in the United States, a couple weeks, Poland was overran, and it was a surprise attack by Germany. Well, it was no surprise, as most of you probably know here. Poland spent several years preparing for the inevitability of war that was going to come to the best of their abilities. Still, when it came, they were overmatched, of course. We also hear that Poland was overrun in a couple short weeks. Primarily we hear by the Germans, but what's often forgotten is it wasn't a couple short weeks, it was more like 5 or 6, which doesn't sound like a big deal until we get a little bit later in the presentation. But it's important to remember Germany conquered, if you will, maybe slightly more than half of Poland. And I go to that first quote, the fastest, most decisive campaign of the war. It doesn't take much research to find out that is far from the truth. Germany took over approximately half of Poland. The eastern half on September 17th was invaded by the Soviet Union from the east. They took over the other half. You're fighting a two-front war against the two monumental empires, if you will, in Europe at the time. Professor Braun used a phrase earlier about never surrendered. A gentleman he referred to never surrendered. It's important to remember, too, the nation of Poland never surrendered. So the campaign, if you will, lasted from September 1st, 1939 until the end of the war, and beyond, really. But so the statistics of the campaign, the losses on the German side, again, we hear about how quick and decisive this campaign was. It's important to remember, after invading Poland, Hitler's plan was to turn his forces west, and by November, to be invading France. Well, the Polish defenses were so strong and so effective, he had to delay that invasion of France for another 7 months. It didn't happen until the spring of 1940. We hear this period all the time called the Phony War, this interim period between the end, if you will, of the Polish campaign and the beginning of the invasion of Western France. Well, there's a lot of people in this room who were there, and people have been referred to. I can assure you, they'll tell you it was anything but phony. Tens of thousands of Poles were executed, imprisoned, deported, arrested, tortured, murdered during this quote-unquote phony war. But evidently, as mentioned earlier at the beginning of this conference, I think it's referred to in the West as a phony war simply because it didn't affect them. So not only did they pay little attention to it then, they pay little attention to it now. So I go back to the quickest, most decisive campaign of the war quote. In about 6 weeks, Germany took over about half of Poland, right? In about 4.5 weeks, France, Belgium, Holland, all fell to Nazi Germany. That's less time, and the map on your left, again, illustrates the western portion of Poland that was occupied by the Nazis. The map on the right, in yellow, France, Holland, Normandy, etc., Belgium. The geography of that portion of the campaign, much shorter, and in my opinion, much more decisive. The geography of that portion of Europe dwarfs that little half of Poland that was occupied by the Nazis. So again, I say it's lazy at best to refer to the Polish campaign as the shortest, most decisive battle of the war. One of the other things we learned about when I was a kid, if anything, Polish Air Force, destroyed on the ground. A couple hours into the Luftwaffe bombed Poland, and the Polish Air Force was destroyed on the ground. Well, I think everybody here knows that couldn't be further from the truth as well. Most of what we would refer to as tactical Polish aircraft were moved away from primary bases, and they remained active for several weeks until they ran out of fuel, ammunition, spare parts, etc. During the September campaign, the Polish Air Force destroyed about 10 to 12% of the attacking Luftwaffe forces. It may not sound that significant, but I like to relate it to that quote about the Polish Air Force being destroyed on the ground. It's pretty impressive to destroy 10% of the attacking enemy forces when you were destroyed on the ground in a couple hours. Simply didn't happen, right? Many Polish pilots escaped to France and fought in France. Again, escaped to Great Britain and began to assimilate into British squadrons and then form complete Polish squadrons, bomber, fighter squadrons. At the height, the Polish Air Force personnel, pilots, ground crew, armorers, mechanics, etc., constituted approximately 20% of the Royal Air Force. The British Royal Air Force was manned, 20% of the British Royal Air Force was manned by Polish staff at the peak of World War II. Again, we just simply don't have time to go through all the statistics and data, but another forgotten portion of the Polish contribution to World War II was North Africa. We heard a lot about the British, or rather the Australian 9th Infantry Division at Tobruk. Well, the 1st Independent Carpathian Polish Brigade was there as well, defending Tobruk and attacking into North Africa against Rommel's Africa Corps forces. I go back to this quote again: most decisive aggression of the war. Half of Poland in about 6 weeks. On the map on the right, it's hard to tell, but that light. In 1940, when the Germans turned their forces eastward and invaded the Soviet Union, in approximately 5 weeks, they took over, in terms of geography, probably 5 times the footprint in the Soviet Union as they did Poland in 1939 in a little over 6 weeks. So again, I just kind of reiterate that point. It's not only is it factually untrue, but I think is lazy from a lot of historians to simply repeat that over and over and over again as fact when it simply isn't. So, Polish Second Corps was formed primarily, partly from that 1st Independent Carpathian Brigade that fought in North Africa, but primarily from following Operation Barbarossa, when the Soviet Union was being overrun by the Nazi forces. They were running out of men quicker than they could defend cities, and so they had several 100,000 Poles primarily. I guess I shouldn't say primarily, but a lot of them were soldiers from captured and deported during the September campaign. And so negotiations took place, and a lot of those Polish citizens, among them soldiers, were released, found their way to the Middle East, and became part of what will later become known as General Anders' Second Corps, fought in Italy. And in fact, General Anders was given command of the entire Adriatic sector of Italy, commanding French and Italian troops in addition to the Poles. So Polish forces technically didn't take part in the Normandy invasion, but shortly thereafter, when the Allies were bogged down in the bocage, the hedgerows of Normandy, Polish 1st Armored Division, actually led the breakout and was credited with capturing entire German field army in the town of Chambois. Their last action was to, I guess we'd say, occupy the town of Wilhelmshaven, where the Soviet submarine base was located, headquarters was located. Pardon me? Oh, I'm sorry, I said Soviet German, thank you. Also, a little often forgotten part of Polish contribution to the World War II, there were tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Polish soldiers that fought with the Soviet Red Army as the Soviets attacked from the east into Poland again. They liberated Polish back up. Some of those Poles released from labor camps in the Soviet Union that didn't make it to the Middle East to join General Anders' Second Corps were given the option of joining the Soviet Red Army. Well, under the guise, the promise of being able to fight for their homeland and theoretically establish their freedom once the war was over, Didn't happen, but of course, tens to hundreds of thousands of Poles fought with the Soviet Red Army into Berlin to the final days of the war. We know a little bit about the home army and the campaign at home. Again, here, the United States and the West, most people don't know. We hear a lot about the French underground, among others. The underground, the Polish underground, in terms of manpower, was the largest underground force, larger than the rest of the European underground forces combined. Numbers vary in estimates, but certainly as many as 350, 400, maybe more, 1,000 people were actively part of the Polish underground. The primary goal of the Polish underground was diversionary tactics for most of the war. Their sort of crowning jewel accomplishment, they hoped, would be the liberation of Warsaw. As the Soviets were advancing from the east into Poland, they radioed messages to the Polish underground to begin the Warsaw Uprising. No sooner did the Warsaw Uprising begin, the Soviet advance stopped. Joseph Stalin, no friend of Germany, no friend of the Poles, figured, why is he going to expend his forces trying to liberate Warsaw? Just let the Nazis and the Poles kill each other and then take over Warsaw once they were done. And that's essentially what happened. There were some 40,000 normal Polish citizens that fought in the Warsaw Uprising. When it began, most of them didn't have weapons. Figured the person next to them would probably die and wouldn't need it long, or they were able to attack some German depots and recover some weaponry that they were able to use in the uprising. And that fight lasted well into 5 or 6 weeks, until they ran out of food, water, ammunition, medicine. A tragic story, and in fact, negotiations took place long and hard to allow airdrops to resupply the Polish forces in Warsaw, but the Soviets would not allow Allied aircraft to enter what was then Soviet airspace, so that never happened. Until a few airdrops happened much later, when the forces were so compressed that the supplies didn't even really make it to them, so they never made an impact on the battle. The fight lasted for 63 days with little to no armament and little to no resupply. During and shortly after the Warsaw Uprising, Hitler ordered the city leveled. About 85% of Warsaw was destroyed during and after the Warsaw Uprising. And of course, shortly after the battle was over, the Soviets resumed their offensive and marched into the western half of Poland. There's a very famous book a book and a movie called A Bridge Too Far, Operation Market Garden. It was a massive British airborne operation into strategic bridges across the Rhine River to secure crossing points across the Rhine into Germany. It was a doomed operation, but a lot of people do not realize that the Polish Independent Parachute Brigade took part in that battle from the very first days. Anti-tank forces dropped in with the British airborne elements, and later on, the Polish Brigade was dropped in to reinforce the British soldiers in Arnhem. That Polish Brigade was formed hoping they'd be able to parachute into Warsaw during the Warsaw Uprising, but their losses were so severe during that Operation Market Garden that they were not able to drop in and support that uprising. So a lot has been talked about in this conference, and I'm sure will continue to be talked about. So Poland was an ally during the Second World War on the winning side. In the end, they lost everything. They lost their country. They lost their freedom. In my research, again, I point out, I was privileged to meet people like a gentleman by the name of Zygmunt Kornash, who was imprisoned in a Soviet labor camp, escaped on his own, made his way to the Middle East, became part of General Ander's Second Corps, was injured at Monte Cassino as a forward artillery observer, couldn't return home to Poland. He eventually ended up emigrating to the United States, and he became an engineer for General Motors. I met a woman by the name of Helena Konwiak, who was a teenager living in Warsaw, and her brothers were part of the Polish underground. She worked as a courier, and during the Warsaw Uprising, she worked as a nurse. And I'm often asked what is my favorite story from these people. I don't have a favorite story. It's really hard to pick. They're all amazing. I have a favorite quote, and it's from her. On many occasions in talking to her, she would say, "Can you imagine? Can you imagine 17 years old holding up a flashlight while a doctor sews some teenager's arm back on?" I can't imagine. All I can do is hope I've contributed a little bit to telling her story and other people's stories, that it doesn't die with them. That, like, the people organizing this conference and all of you here, remember them and their contributions to history. So thank you again for allowing me to be here. I'm humbled to be able to be here and present to you today.
Thank you, Mr. Koskodan.